Thank you for joining CIE's weekly analysis of the Hamas-Israel war. Today's webinar will focus on women's response to the war with Hamas. This topic is very far-reaching, and it slices into all facets of Israeli society, politics, the army culture, and of course, women having been taken hostage and brutalized by Hamas's genocidal acts on October 7th. As we learned this past Saturday night, this war is not merely between Israel and Hamas. It's a fight for the existence of Israel, and it has to do with liberty, freedom, democracy, and the right of a country to self-determination. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and Emory University emeritus professor of contemporary Middle Eastern history and political science. We're joined today by Colonel Pnina Sharvit Baruch, who's a senior researcher with the Institute for National Security Studies and heads its program on law and national security. She retired from the IDF in 2009. Dr. Julia Elad-Strenger is a political psychologist and a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University. She specializes in the psychology of political behavior and public opinion. Yocheved Kim Ruttenberg is a free-spirited entrepreneur, as she is fond of describing herself, who co-founded Sword of Iron Israel Volunteer Opportunities after October 7th. She originally hails from the United States, and she ended up in Israel on October 20th, and still is working her wonders with all those volunteers who are descending on Israel, including my own wife. Please note that all our previous webinars are archived. You can see them and you can listen to them. They're at israeled.org. Many of you have joined our learning community at israeled.org. You've shown your support with contributions to our work to sustain our small staff. Visit the website and help us continue. Pnina, speak a little bit about the impact that you've seen this war having on Israel and Israelis and Israeli women. Give us your sense of Israel today, Israel October 6th.
Until the 6th of October, we were very worried as women. There were many women organizations that were involved in the protests against government policy because it was viewed that one of the threats of curtailing judicial intervention would be to have less rights for women because the courts pushed ahead equality for women in Israel, including opening up the pilot course in the Israeli Air Force, and since then opening up more and more positions to women in the military. I was one of those worried women. The 7th of October, everything changed. It shook us completely, men and women alike. The sense of security that we had hasn't yet returned. The fear that we are not only under a threat to our democratic values, but under an existential threat from enemies that are after our destruction, the destruction of the state of Israel. This is not about ending the 1967 occupation. This is about ending Israel's physical existence. And then when we saw the waves of what's happening in the world of anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic protests, we see also the idea of eliminating the right of Israel to exist. So Israel on both levels. And I think women found themselves on the front here. First of all, of course, the Hamas itself, when they entered, the Hamas terrorists and the other terrorists on the 7th of October, they went to the homes and they carried out horrendous actions, including the torture of families, tying up children and parents and torturing them in front of the other, rape of women, of boys. And we know of many cases. Finally, the UN, at least one of its officials, has acknowledged these cases, burning people alive. So terrible act of torture. And then in the Nova Festival, all these young women, so many of them were also raped, gang raped before they were murdered. My electrician's 2 daughters were murdered in the party, 2 young girls. And I was very early on following these allegations of this torture and then also of rape. I was in this commission that we established of women. And then when I started hearing more and more evidence about that, the main thing I was thinking is, wow, I hope they were not raped before they were murdered. Not as if I hope they would not be murdered. So really the home front is the front. On the other hand, we also saw from a women's point of view that women were heroes, were involved in defending their homes, in defending villages, were the ones that had the initiatives many times to call all the other guards. For example, some women were in charge of the internal security in the village, for example, and we have women in tanks Women in tanks are limited until now only to borders of peace. So they were on the Egyptian border. They came in, they fought for 14 hours in a tank, was out going out and killed so many terrorists. And then since also the ground incursion started, we have women in Gaza Strip, in the front lines, many paramedics, but others also doing explosive jobs and other military actions. So this is proven to those that were doubting that women can also be in the front lines in combat operations. So it gives us also a lot of pride and hope that in the future we will overpass the barriers that we had until now of integrating women into all units of the military, at least giving them the opportunity, a fair opportunity to try to get to any unit, including combat units, something that the IDF hasn't opened until now. What we don't have enough is women in the decision-making processes. Unfortunately, in the cabinet, in the government, we have very few women in the government and very few women in the cabinet and in the smaller cabinet. The voice of women is not there, and it is important because I think when women are around the table, decision-making improves.
Julia, from your vantage point as a political scientist, what generalities can you take away from these last 6 months that maybe the general public might not understand or fully realize is what happened to Israeli society and what occurred maybe specifically to women in Israeli society?
Before women, I'll start with the Israeli society because that's my field. I've been looking very closely at what have been happening to the Israeli society since the war. And especially what I'm focusing on is two big questions. So what is happening to Israelis' worldviews and ideologies since the war? And what is happening to societal cohesion or to the relations between groups within Israel? So I'll start with the second one. So the question of what is happening to Israeli society, the social fabric, the relations between the different groups in society. The first thing is that we tend to think that a common threat or a common enemy, and especially something as extreme as this war, brings people together. Actually, what we're seeing is that this is not necessarily so. It started actually very beautifully. People came together in volunteering, people from all over society, religious and non-religious, and women and men, Mizrahi and Ashkenazi, and rightists and leftists, everybody, and Jews and Arabs, of course, were doing a lot together. But the point is that that was quite short-lived, and I'm talking about the groups themselves and not individuals. We know that individuals still in the army and in volunteering, they work together regardless of where they come from. But in terms of the intergroup relations in society, and that's my field, what we see is that perceptions of cohesion grew, but actual cohesion and actual feelings of willingness to cooperate across intergroup boundaries and emotions towards groups, towards one another, didn't really change since the war. And actually, the most interesting things we see is what we see between Jews and Arabs in Israel, among Israelis, so not Palestinians who live outside Israel. Among Arabs, we see increased willingness for cohesion and cooperation and more positive emotions toward Jews. But among Jews, we see, of course, a very sharp decrease in their willingness to see this as a common threat, a common endeavor of Jews and Arabs in Israel to try to find a way to work together on the challenges that Israel is facing. Regarding the political views of Israelis, that's another interesting question because it seems like since the war, and we have empirical data supporting that, that people kind of took a right-wing shift in their attitudes. People are more militant, people are more right-wing, more nationalistic maybe since this war. But on the other hand, support for the government right after the war started really declined. And this is kind of this interesting tension that happened. We see also evidence for a process of polarization, and that touches upon what I said before, the relations between groups in Israel. We see that the war became also kind of this reason for a blame game, even increased blame game between rightists and leftists in Israel. Who is responsible for the war? Is it Netanyahu and the settler movement, or the military establishment, or is it actually the leftists that brought about this war and the protest movement against the judicial reform that brought out this war? So we see a lot of blaming and a lot of polarization also in Israeli society between rightists and leftists following this war and how they interpret the war. and what should be done. And even the question of hostages became a right versus leftist issue.
When you say there hasn't been the cooperation, well, there wasn't really great cooperation even before Netanyahu was elected. We're not talking about a major new cleavage in Israeli society. You had these cleavages anyway.
We always have this hope when there's a war, everybody comes together and tries to think about the common good and everything when we have a common enemy. And what we're seeing is that it's not so. It's very much not so on the intergroup level. And that may disappoint some people because that is the common wisdom, that when there's a common enemy, we start saying, okay, we should all be friends and work together. And it's not what we're seeing. The whole Haredi question going to the army, so religious versus secular, right versus left, Jews versus Arab, that even became worse from before the war to now because all these things come up. I know it goes against some kind of common wisdom of common threat creates a more cohesive society. And we're seeing that it's definitely not so.
Well, it created enough cohesion to bring the country together to try and push back Hamas's initial efforts. That you can't deny. The military may have made grave mistakes at the very beginning, but people ran into the fire rather than running away from it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean cohesion, and that doesn't mean cooperation, and that doesn't mean collaboration or coordination, but it was sufficient in order to sustain the state.
What we see is incredible commitment to the country and to its safety and to its future. Absolutely. But the question is, what is the future vision of Israel that people are expecting and people want to fulfill? Here we're seeing big gaps. So there's a common commitment, but not a common vision.
Vision is tough. Yocheved, what prompted you to pick yourself up and go to Israel to engage in what you thought was essential for someone from the diaspora to make a difference?
I have a brother that's here serving in the army, and on the 7th, he drove straight down by himself and was fighting, and it was terrifying. And I told myself originally, if I never get a chance to see him again, God forbid something happens and I didn't come, I would never forgive myself. I also have close friends who were directly affected. The Sharabi brothers are the uncle of one of my very good friends. I just felt like my friends and my family really needed me here. I wasn't supposed to be here for as long as I have ended up. Originally, it was only supposed to be a 2-week trip. And 3 days before my return flight, I quit my job and decided I was going to stay. I gave away my car. I gave away all my stuff. My friends took my plans. And I just said, I'm going to be here and figure it out. I met my co-founder and we were discussing what needs to be done, what's missing in Israel. Volunteering when the war first started is scattered. It was everywhere. And you really could only find opportunities if you heard about it or if you were in the right group chat. And so my co-founder Chagit happened to be in all the right group chats, and she put me in touch, and we decided that we were going to open up a Facebook group to centralize all the volunteering efforts because there was a huge gap and the need was there. So I just started Google translating, copy, paste, and posting in the group. And I decided I just wasn't ready to leave Israel. I couldn't leave this community that I was building. And as it continued to grow and we started to see more and more people, it's not just Jews, we have non-Jews as well, but it is a lot of the diaspora. So we started to see them coming to Israel. I really felt like I needed to be here to grow this community.
What prompted a lot of the people to volunteer? What's the common thread?
There's 2 wars happening right now. There's the war happening in Israel, and there's a war happening on Jews. And people outside of Israel feel so helpless, and they're experiencing this war in their own way. On college campuses, in their streets, many Jews feel so unsafe walking around their own communities. And then their brothers and sisters here in Israel are in pain, and they feel like there's nothing that they can do. So then when they see these opportunities and they realize that they can actually come make a difference by going to a farm and picking fruit, they jump at it because it's their way of being able to help. So I think the common theme is helplessness.
Since 1995, there's been the steady incline of women participating in different aspects of the IDF. Pnina, how difficult has it been to engage and be accepted as equals in this very, very important institution of the state?
Well, there is, first of all, some correlation between the status of women in general in society and in the IDF. So in the beginning, actually before the state of Israel existed, when everybody was fighting for its existence, so you had the Haganah and Etzel Lehi, also the women were there. And actually in the War for Independence, we even had women pilots participate, because then it was a time where everybody was fighting. The youngsters were fighting at the age of 15, and women, whoever could fight was fighting. But after that, when the state was established, there was a decision to recruit men and women and to have a compulsory draft also for women, but still the women were brought back to the more traditional positions of helping men in secretarial work, manpower, things like that. After the Yom Kippur War, they needed more women in technical jobs, and in the 1980s instead of men. So it was based on the need. In 95, after the petition to the High Court of Justice of Alice Miller, the court said that they have to open the pilot course to women, because the reason that the military gave for not opening it was budget. They would have to open more rooms for women and facilities, and they said that's not a good enough answer. There is a right for equality, a right for equal opportunity. And in 2000, the law was actually amended so that all positions would be open to men and women, except when the essence and nature of the position requires otherwise. So many jobs were indeed opened, including certain combat positions, mainly behind the lines, like artillery, as I said, tanks in the peaceful borders, which also took time, and also other operations on the borders with Egypt and Jordan, for example. But still, the combat units remained closed. There is an open petition to the High Court of Justice on this issue, give us opportunity for women, at least an opportunity to try to get to these units without lowering the standards, just equal opportunity. There were a few sessions already in the court. I'm a founding member of Forum Dvorah, which is a forum of women promoting more women in national security and foreign policy. So we were also friends of the court, also issued an analysis that I made looking at what happens in other militaries, because the US also opened all positions to women, and we had some reports by NATO explaining that there's no reason not to do the same in Israel. And the IDF was still pushing back. So they said, okay, we'll open a pilot here, we will try here, we'll open another unit, but still pushing back. And I think it comes from two main reasons. The one is the militaristic, machoistic, I would say, kind of position that women are not cut for it. They will undermine the success. It will mean lowering standards and such kinds of visions. The second one, which I think is more central, is religious leadership. Concern and worry that if there are women around these units where you have many religious soldiers, they would be a bad influence. These young soldiers would be tempted in some way to maybe become less religious. And I think this today is the main counterforce that we have. So I think we are in a move to have more and more women in more units. And the war, as I said before, was a very strong indication that all the excuses why women are not cut for it are not valid. But we still have this obstacle, this fear of having women and religious men in the same units, and a lot of pushback from those kinds of elements. And some of them are in the government, which are more religious, conservative elements. So we still have to overcome that objection. And it's not easy, because you have many units that the religious soldiers, especially the one from the religious Zionism camp, really play a very central role in the combat units in the IDF today. You can't just disregard these concerns, and this is beyond the Haredim and the ultra-Orthodox that are not enlisting at the moment, but if they do, then we even have more problems, because they can't have women around them. They have very strict conditions that they put, and that's one of them, to even agree to be enlisted.
Was the IDF ahead or behind in terms of incorporating women into important places and important decision-making? Where would you put it in relation to, let's say, business, economics, academics?
In general, I would say there's a correlation there. Also in Israel, the IDF plays a very significant role in the opportunities that you have after leaving the IDF. So if you get to senior roles in the IDF, if you're a general, for example, that opens up many opportunities in the political, in the public sector, but also in the business sector and the private sector. Until now, we've had only 3 major generals who were women. One was head of the personnel command, and 2 are from the legal, where I also come from, but you don't have any central figure, commander, for example. So that limits a lot of opportunities. And in general, People always ask, what did you do in the military? A friend brings a friend in Israel, and the military has a very strong impact also of what happens outside the military. So there is a correlation there, and also what the society thinks affects what happens inside the military. And at the moment, again, we see this government that is comprised of many religious parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties that have no women inside these parties, and other that are very conservative parties. So we had a drop in the number of ministers from the previous government that was only there for 1 year, where you had a third, I think, to almost no women ministers. And general managers of the ministries, they were around 10 or 11 in the previous government. In this government, out of 30-something ministries, that's 1. So we're going backwards, but it's because at the moment we have the more conservative and religious elements in government.
Julia, let me ask you a question about Israeli society over the last 2 to 3 years, and if the or the divisions or the lack of coordination, if it's become more or become less.
We actually have data, longitudinal data, meaning that we're following the different divisions in Israeli society, or at least the 4 main divisions in Israeli society, from the beginning of 2019 until now, periodically. So we had the judicial reform, and we have the war, and we have all these things. And what we're seeing is that the divisions or cleavages are pretty stable. And what happens is that with different events, the salience or the awareness, maybe the salience of different divisions becomes a bit higher in the Israeli psyche or the Israeli discourse. But what we need to remember is that all these divisions, at least within the Jewish community, so if we're talking about the ethnic division between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, Eastern and Western Jews, if we're looking at right and left, if we're looking at religious and secular, these 3 divisions are very highly correlated in people's stereotypes, in people's minds, and in people's identification. So what we see is that these cleavages are reinforcing one another. They're mixed, they're affecting one another, they're very highly correlated. So you cannot talk about any division almost in Israeli society without looking at the others. And when one of them changes, the other change with it. So we can't really look at them in isolation. But as I said, what we're seeing is that these cleavages are pretty stable, except for, as I said, what we saw in the war is something very dramatic with the Jewish-Arab cleavage, how Israeli Arabs view their role in Israeli society and how Jews view Arabs' role in Israeli society. They went 2 different ways since the war. How Arabs see Jews and how Jews see Arabs, their stereotypes towards one another, their emotions towards one another, their willingness to cooperate, to collaborate, their willingness to violence against one another, their trust towards one another. We see that among Arabs, there's a betterment of attitudes towards Jews, and actually they see the war as a war against Israelis and not a war against Jews. And Jews see it the opposite. So Jews see this as a war against Jews. Also, Jews outside see this as a war against Jews because there are other things going on, the anti-Semitism, which makes the Jewish issue very salient. And that's a big question. Was this war a war against Jews or against Israelis? And for Arabs, this matters. This distinction matters. And for the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Israel, this distinction matters. And we should not forget it when we also frame the war, and especially people who are liberal, people who strive for a better relation between Jews and Arabs in Israel, the way we frame this. And if we only focus on this as a Jewish issue, this is really problematic for our relations, and we see this. We see this in our data. Now, going to women, we're seeing how salient the dual image of women in this war is or became. So on the one hand, the ultimate victim, and on the other hand, the heroes. There's a lot of stories about the heroism of women in this war as soldiers, as military personnel, as security personnel, how they operated also as civilians. And at the same time, they're the ultimate victims of this war. Now, this is very interesting for us as political psychologists, how this relates to common stereotypes about women. And here I will connect to what Pnina said in a second, but just I want to say that in general, the stereotype towards women, that's what we see in the literature, is that they're attributed high warmth, meaning they're warm, they're kind, they're agreeable, they're peace-seeking. And at the same time, they have low competence. This is the common stereotype towards women. All the stories of heroism of women here in this war is kind of there to battle this stereotype of low competence. But the stereotype of high warmth and agreeableness, I want to just turn our attention a bit to the danger in that. And although there's something also very positive and super important, I say this as a woman and as a researcher and everything, that we need to have women more in decision making. It's important not only for issues relating to gender or to women, and women are competent enough to be everywhere that men are. At the same time, we have this stereotype, the thought that if we only bring women to decision making, then we're going to have more peaceful relations between groups, then the militancy will go down. That actually plays on this stereotype of women as warm and peaceful and all that. And actually, we did a big study in Israel, a few studies, and we showed that women support militancy and political violence to the same extent as men. And even more so, there are types of political violence that women support even more than men, such as exclusion of certain populations. Of course, we want women in decision-making just as men, but I'm afraid of saying that that's because they would be less militant and more peaceful. We have other reasons to want them there.
Yocheved, did you detect that women had a greater zest, a greater urgency to be productive, to make the contribution?
It's actually so interesting that you asked this question because our group is 74% women. Whether it's the women being on our group to plan the trip for their husbands, because we do hear that, or it's women really feeling the pull to come more than men. It's a hard question. I can't really answer it, but I can tell you that we have analytics and our analytics show 74% women on our page. I think in general, women feel nurturing more. And so when they see something like this happening, they want to jump the way that the men want to jump and go to the army. A lot of women want to come and help. What we are seeing is a lot of guys coming and working with soldiers. So whether they're doing barbecues, getting equipment, and a lot of women are coming and dealing with hostage families, evacuees. So we're seeing a mix.
Does that reinforce a stereotype?
Maybe.
If this were 2027 and we're looking back on it, we'd have a lot more information and maybe it wouldn't be as dynamic and changing as quickly. What should Israeli society and what should diaspora Jewry or even non-Jews, what should we learn from what happened on October 7th about Israel's direction as a country? What's the big takeaway?
One of the biggest lessons that I've taken away and that I've seen from other people is that when there is a need, you jump and you just do it. You don't necessarily have to think about it. Like logically, thinking about coming to Israel in a war zone to come volunteer doesn't make sense. And yet we're seeing thousands and thousands of people coming. There were over 78,000 people that came to Israel last month. The same way that I saw a need and I just jumped to do it. You have to follow your gut. You have to live life, take risks, and live life passionately and purposefully. And I think that's what this war has really taught us, that life is so short and living in your comfort zone is the safe way to go.
How much of that is wanting to do and wanting to be productive and wanting to contribute? And how much of that is in, let's say, Jewish DNA of the next person up serves to complete the task?
As Jews, we're resilient. That's proven over and over again in history. And so when all this happened, there was a time and a place to grieve, but then very quickly we saw our people stand up and say, okay, this is sad, this is horrific, but what needs to be done? And I think that really runs in our blood. I think it goes back generations.
Julia, why do you suppose Israeli Arabs felt an identity to Israel?
Their identification with Israel grew on average after the war. First of all, they were targeted just like Jewish Israelis. They were abducted in lower numbers because they were not in these areas, but they were, especially Bedouins. They're targeted by missiles. And it's interesting, we see Arab Israelis feel more Israeli, more committed to Israel, and more positive towards Jewish Israelis. And at the same time, and for me it's not a contradiction, they're actually supporting more peace with the Palestinians. So what they're saying now after the war compared to before, that peace with the Palestinians is essential for our future. So that's how they're taking it. And among Jews, we see a decrease in support for future compromises with the Palestinians. So that's also an interesting thing. Why I think Arabs identify more, aside from what I said, I don't know. Maybe we should ask them, or those who identify more. I'm sure there's also those who identify less. It's an average thing. But you asked before what we should do, what should be the step forward. I will answer from, let's say, a public opinion perspective, not a personal one, more like from my field. I hope that we all take this as an opportunity to create a more complex discourse and not a flat one or a one-sided one. And it's very easy to fall exactly to that position. We see that from the Jordan to the Sea, and we see that from the Jordan to the Sea and the Jewish side. This is an opportunity to have more complex discussions, to see the complexity in the situation and not try to reduce it. And it's much harder when there's war. It's harder for me too, as an Israeli, to try to keep a complex view. But I'm very afraid of the tendency now to try to push people into, are you on this side or on this side? Do you see this or do you see only this? And I think this is a very dangerous tendency. And that is what I hope these discussions, both in Israel and among the Jews outside and the non-Jews outside, could promote. That's our job.
Nuance is very difficult in any field at any time, even for the Israeli government, to thread the needle on what's an appropriate response to what happened last Saturday night and what's overkill.
If I can add to what Julia said about why the Arab population saw themselves more Israeli, we have to understand the Hamas doesn't only threaten Israel or the Jews. The Hamas threatens any moderate Palestinian. So even an Arab Israeli that views himself or herself as a Palestinian, but lives in a democratic society, fears the Hamas. So Hamas victory is bad for any chances of a peaceful resolution of the conflict, of living here somehow peacefully. So one of the takes for me, I think, is that we cannot tolerate elements like the Hamas to control an area, to be the de facto government in an area where they can pose a threat to us. But on the other hand, even though many of the Palestinians support the Hamas and supported the 7th of October, they're not going to go anywhere. So eventually, we will need to find some kind of compromise. So the big challenge is really to get to the complexity of it. And yes, Israelis are feeling now very threatened. They also see that they had support to the Hamas, so they say all the Palestinians are against us, and the Palestinians also include the Arab Israelis. But eventually, I think the challenge, and here it's a big challenge, is to go beyond these feelings of fear and suspicion that are valid feelings, by the way, but still to see that we have to somehow find a way to live together. And the second point is that what we see is a very, very low level of trust in the government. And here I would link it also to the lack of women in the government, not because women are more peaceful, peace-loving than men, but I think when you have women, and especially when you have enough women around the table, and I'm saying this is someone who was many times the only woman around the table in the military, but when you have a few, it's the discussion tend to be less based on ego and more on trying to reach really the best solution beyond just egos. Again, you have egos, women also have egos, but I think men have a much more competitive kind of quality and women are more cooperative, trying to find a solution together. And I think we don't have that enough. The crisis of trust with the government is not just because of the failure of the 7th of October, which most of it was really the military and the intelligence side of it. But I think because the day after the 7th of October, and here the government, I think, failed the people in not writing to this historic event and unifying people and putting down the extreme voices and being there for the families of the hostages and of those that were killed and putting all its emphasis and capabilities in order to immediately try to assist the situation. We saw all these volunteers and this civil society entering into this gap because the government was not there. And even if you can excuse them in the first months or few weeks, but what after that, instead of coming and uniting everybody also from the government perspective, they didn't do it. And I think that's a big failure. And that would be my take. We cannot afford to be split. Our enemies around us are looking for this weakness. They view us as weak when we are viewed with all these internal rifts. That's why I would expect the government to do more to make the rifts within the society smaller and not to enlarge them.
Probably we're all listening to your insightful remarks and saying, wouldn't it be better if there were more competence than ego? Wouldn't it be better if there was more pragmatism than ideology? Israelis have proven, I think, since October 7th, and certainly before that, that confidence and perseverance and sacrifice are pretty important if you want to make it to tomorrow. And you have to bury those differences in order to get to tomorrow. Wishing you all a very good Passover, if that's what you're celebrating. And again, join us at CIE, learn a little bit more about Israel. It makes us all stronger and better.